All right. Welcome, everybody. My name is Dr. Jemar Tisby. I am so thankful that you made some time to join me on this Thursday evening as we're recording. If you wouldn't mind, just drop a comment. Let me know where you're tuning in from. I always like to know that. It's always fun to make different connections. Let me know where you're tuning in from as we get started here. This is What to the Slave is the 4th of July, an Independence Day teach-in. What to the Slave is the 4th of July, an Independence Day teach-in. The reason why I wanted to do this was we're coming up on Independence Day, the 4th of July, 2022. And I wanted us to be able to engage in the holiday, commemorate the holiday more consciously, more circumspectly, from a more informed standpoint. So what I want to do is begin by giving you an overview of what we're going to talk about. There's so much we could talk about around the 4th of July. What I want to talk about in order to narrow our scope is a speech that Frederick Douglass gave in 1852 on the topic of the 4th of July and independence and freedom. I thought that would be a good way to sort of focus our conversation, narrow down the scope of topics. And so we'll talk about the Declaration of Independence, what it was, why it was. We'll talk about the language of the Declaration contrasted with the reality of slavery. We'll talk a little bit about Frederick Douglass and who he was. Then we'll dive in and spend most of our time on the text of the speech in a few parts. We'll talk about the context in which the speech was given, both national and that occasion. We'll talk about what Douglass said about founding fathers and patriotism. We'll also talk about what Douglass said in terms of an indictment of the United States and this holiday of Independence Day. So, and then we'll talk about what does it mean to us today, the 4th of July? How should we think about it? How should we commemorate it, if at all? And that'll be that. But at the very end, of course, I would love to hear from you. So as you are tuning in, please feel free to drop your questions in the chat there. I see folks from Iowa, Raleigh, North Carolina, Connecticut. So grateful that you all are joining us, DC area. Let's go ahead and dive in. I want to begin with one of the most powerful quotes from Frederick Douglass's speech, and it goes like this. What to the American slave is your 4th of July? I answer, a day that reveals to him more than all other days in the year the gross injustice and cruelty to which he is the constant victim. To him, your celebration is a sham, your boasted liberty an unholy license, your national greatness swelling vanity. Your sounds of rejoicing are empty and heartless, your denunciations of tyrants, brass-fronted impudence, your shouts of liberty and equality, hollow mockery. Your prayers and hymns, your sermons and thanksgivings, with all your religious parade and solemnity, are to him mere bombast, fraud, deception, impiety, and hypocrisy, a thin veil to cover up crimes which would disgrace a nation of savages. There is not a nation on the earth guilty of practices more shocking and bloody than are the people of these United States at this very hour. My. Tell us how you really feel, Frederick. Incredible. What we're talking about here and what Douglass is talking about is the tension, the very obvious tension between freedom and unfreedom in what became the United States, between liberty and bondage. How could a nation talk about the natural rights and equality of human beings while at the same time enslaving people. How could those two coexist? What then did the words of the Declaration of Independence mean to people of African descent who, by law and custom in this fledgling nation, were subjected to perpetual involuntary servitude? What freedom are we talking about here? Is there anything of Independence Day that a relatively historically conscious person can and should celebrate? By the way, I'm speaking into a screen, so I'm going to need your help on this evening. If I say something that you agree with or that strikes a chord or that resonates with you, let me know in the chat. That's going to be your textual virtual amen corner. So give me some feedback and input as I go, please, because I don't want to be doing this alone. I want to be on a journey with you. So we're talking about, is there anything here that a historically conscious person can or should celebrate around American independence? Let me read to you a quote from someone else. Dr. Samuel Johnson was an English writer and an Anglican. He asked this mortifying question. He said, "How is it that we hear the loudest yelps for liberty from the drivers of Negroes?" Did you hear that? How is it that we hear the loudest yelps for liberty from the drivers of Negroes? So the point and the goal of all of this is to try to think about the 4th of July more carefully. And however you choose to commemorate it, to do so from an informed standpoint. So let's dive in. Let's talk about the context here. By the way, thanks, David. You said, I'm finding it hard to feel celebratory on the 4th. I think that's probably due to a lot of reasons, not least of which are some of the Supreme Court decisions which have been handed down just in the past week. Understandable. I also still have behind me the Juneteenth flag. I encourage you to go back to my previous video. It's a Juneteenth teach-in where I talk about the symbolism of this flag, but it's red, white, and blue. And the symbolism there was that Black people are Americans too. Therefore, we are entitled to all the same rights and privileges and liberties of landowning white men who seem to be the focus during the Declaration of Independence. It also, this flag, an interesting contrast or complementary symbolic dialogue between the freedom evidenced by emancipation from race-based chattel slavery that Juneteenth represents, and the freedom or the independence from Britain that the 4th of July represents. Those two exist in the same annals of the same nation, and we have to grapple with them, which is what part of this teaching is about. So in 1776, delegates from British colonies in North America get together. And they get together as a result of the buildup of a lot of things happening. So the French and Indian War on the other side of the pond, called the 7 Years' War, was a war in North America between the British and the French. The British ultimately prevailed in a sense, and so they were able to kick the French out of most of the lands in North America, as well as Spain. That had all kinds of implications for Native Americans who now were not able to play these different imperial powers off of one another and sort of became the focus of one imperial power. And that meant bad news for Native Americans. But also, it meant that the British colonists didn't need Britain to protect them from France and Spain in the same way. What happened was essentially these white colonists started feeling themselves saying, why do we need Britain anymore? And then on top of that, Britain was exercising more and more control over commerce, particularly over the taxation of different goods and products. Of course, the Boston Tea Party is going to stand out in this regard, as colonists are rebelling against these taxes and this control of trade. So there's a series of conflicts, battles, skirmishes for several years. Finally, the colonists say, you know what? We need to not be part of Britain anymore. We don't need to be, we need to be our own nation. And so they stated their reasons in writing in a document we now know as the Declaration of Independence, July 4th, 1776. So I mentioned in the newsletter post, by the way, I'll mention this several times. Please do subscribe to my newsletter, JemarTisby.substack.com. I'm dropping it in the chat. That is how I am able to bring these tidbits to you. So if you would like for me to continue doing these teach-in, please subscribe for free. Also consider becoming a paid subscriber. That's my little commercial there. So the delegates, the people who signed the Declaration of Independence, I mentioned this in my newsletter post. There were 56 signers of the Declaration of Independence, 41 of whom held slaves. Later on, some of them changed their mind and freed slaves, but at the time of the signing, 41 of them were enslavers, 41 of 56. The primary author of the Declaration of Independence was a famous enslaver, Thomas Jefferson, owned hundreds of slaves, had decades-long relationship, mistress with a Black woman, Sally Hemings, by whom he had several children. Jefferson didn't think Black people were equal to white people or people of European descent, even though he had statements talking about the heinousness of slavery sometimes. But he was the main author of the Declaration of Independence and a notorious enslaver. What's interesting to note is that in the first draft of the Declaration of Independence, there was actually an anti-slavery statement. Here's what it said. In the first draft of the Declaration, it denounced the slave trade as, quote, a cruel war against human nature itself, violating its most sacred rights of life and liberty in the persons of a distant, meaning African people. A cruel war against human nature itself, violating its most sacred rights of life and liberty. Right? That was in the first draft of the Declaration of Independence. Can you imagine if that had remained? What kind of conversation would we be having in the 21st century about independence and liberty and equality if that statement had remained? Well, why didn't it remain? Because delegates from Georgia and South Carolina, two slave states, objected and demanded that it be taken out, and it was. Later on, these delegates and officials crafted what became the United States Constitution. Now, there's been debates within historical circles about whether the Constitution is a pro-slavery document, and in a moment, we'll talk about how Frederick Douglass viewed the Constitution. But what I talk about in The Color of Compromise is how certain scholars think the Constitution is a pro-slavery document, even though it does not contain the words slave or slavery. So how is the Constitution a pro-slavery document? Article 4, Section 2 is basically a precursor to the Fugitive Slave Clause, which we'll talk about in a moment. It basically says if an enslaved person escapes to a state that does not practice slavery, they can be captured and returned to that state. Article 1, Section 2, known as the 3/5 Compromise, which means for the purpose of taxation and representation, enslaved persons count as 3/5 of what a white person does. And then also in the Constitution, it talks about the fact that however you feel about slavery, we can't talk about it for the next 20 years. So when they ratified the Constitution, there was a provision in there that said slavery was not up for debate in the United States until 1808. So that's almost 20 years from when they ratified it. So with that context, let's dive in to Frederick Douglass and the speech. So, of course, Frederick Douglass was born as an enslaved person in Maryland in 1818. He never knew his father. His mother was on a different plantation and so wasn't with him day to day. And she died when he was very young. So, for all intents and purposes, an orphan. He was apprenticed out as the sort of, they call it a body servant, sort of the personal assistant to a white person at the age of 8. And he learned very early on the power of literacy for liberation, for imagination, taught himself to read and write, basically, which would become a huge part of his story as an orator and an abolitionist. And when he was 15, he was hired out as a field hand, which is some of the hardest labor an enslaved person can do. And he rebelled constantly in lots of different ways. So he rebelled by teaching other enslaved people how to read, which was forbidden. He fought back, physically fought back against a person known as a slave breaker, supposed to break the spirit and the will of feisty enslaved people like Douglass, but he fought him and won, basically. And then he even tried unsuccessfully at that point to escape. Later, he got sent back to Baltimore, an urban area. He met a woman named Anna Murray, who he eventually married. She was a free Black woman who helped him escape. And the way Douglass escaped was he disguised himself as a sailor, got on a train headed north, got off in New York, and declared himself free. So that's a little bit of background on Frederick Douglass. He started telling his story of enslavement, and he was remarkable for his oratorical ability, starts going on tours, and all of these things becomes more and more well known. So then it becomes relatively common and frequent that he's invited to places to speak. So this speech, which we're calling What to the Slave is the 4th of July, was given in 1852 on July 5th, actually, a day after July 4th. Given in 1852 at the Corinthian Hall in Rochester, New York. He was there at the invitation of the Rochester Ladies Anti-Slavery Society, the Rochester Ladies Anti-Slavery Society, which sticks out to me because this was a coalition of the willing. It's an anti-slavery society. They invited him. They wanted to hear what he had to say. And he gives this searing indictment of the hypocrisy of the United States. And as a speaker who talks about racial justice, I often wonder, what do you say to a coalition of the willing? What song or sermon do you preach to the choir? And I just thought it was very interesting that Douglass chooses on this occasion to talk to the Anti-Slavery Society about the hypocrisy of slavery. And it goes well. I mean, it's a hard thing to hear, but it gets turned into a pamphlet. It's probably his best known writing outside of his autobiography. So just an interesting thought experiment. What would you say to a crowd today that is pro-racial justice? Would you go the route of Douglass and talk about all these reasons why racism is wrong? Or would you go a different route to try to encourage them or give them practical steps or something? Very interesting. All right. So a bit of the context in which Douglass is speaking, you got to know at least this one bit of background to understand why Douglass says what he says. In 1850, a law was passed called the Fugitive Slave Act. I referred to that a little while ago, talking about the Constitution. Over the course of decades, that idea of returning escaped enslaved people back to slave states, that was severely challenged by anti-slavery people. But it was made a law in the Fugitive Slave Act in 1850, which essentially nationalized race-based chattel slavery. It meant that if you were Black, there was no part of the United States you could escape into and actually find freedom. This became one of the major causes leading up to the Civil War, is that there was this Fugitive Slave Act really collapsed the distance between non-slave holding states and slave holding states. And of course, Black people like Frederick Douglass were outraged, incensed by it. In his speech, Douglass called it a glaring violation of justice in shameless disregard of the forms of administering law, in cunning arrangement to entrap the defenseless, and in diabolical intent. This fugitive slave law stands alone in the annals of tyrannical legislation. This fugitive slave law stands alone in the annals of tyrannical legislation. Wow. All right. So that's what Douglass thought about that. Douglass is also going to give searing indictments of Christians. So here's one quote we'll get into more later. He says, in glaring violation of justice, in shameless disregard of the forms of administering law, in cunning arrangement to entrap the defenseless. Oh, sorry, I just read that. We'll get to his indictment of Christians in a moment. What stands out to me about Douglass's speech is his seeming respect for the founding fathers and his sense of patriotism. Think about that. How could a man born into slavery risked his life to escape, risked his life to speak out against slavery, told his story publicly time and time again in speeches and through his autobiography, had his life threatened, and was an abolitionist, the foremost abolitionist of his time? How could this man have any sort of respect for the founding fathers, have any sort of sense of patriotism? Here's what he said. Fellow citizens, I am not wanting in respect for the fathers of this republic. The signers of the Declaration of Independence were brave men. They were great men too, great enough to give fame to a great age. It does not happen often to a nation to raise at one time such a number of truly great men. The point from which I am compelled to view them is not certainly the most favorable, and yet I cannot contemplate their great deeds with less than admiration. They were statesmen, patriots, and heroes, and for the good they did and the principles they contended for, I will unite with you to honor their memory. How does that strike you? I will unite with them to honor their memory. How does that strike you as a citizen now, as somebody who's interested in racial justice, et cetera, et cetera? What it seems to me to speak to is Douglass's discernment. He's a better person than I am. I get it, Dawn. I get it. It seems to speak to Douglass's attempt to discern the fact that people do both good and bad things. So he's trying to praise them for espousing the ideals of liberty, even as he knows more intimately than any of us alive today the utter debacle of inhumanity that race-based chattel slavery was. But I actually think he's doing something else. I think he is doing that, finding the good in the midst of the darkness. But I also think he's pulling a bit of a rhetorical sleight of hand. A rhetorical sleight of hand. By invoking the founding fathers in this speech, what he's doing, I think, is putting forth these figures that are almost at this time universally acclaimed. He wants to pull them in by joining with them in praising people they think are praiseworthy. But then what he's going to do is use the audience's admiration of the founding fathers to say, but you're not living up to their ideals. He's going to take these figures that are admired and saying, well, if you admire them, why don't you do like them in terms of what they said in the Declaration of Independence and what they intended in terms of the ideals of liberty? So I think he's kind of reeling them in, and then he's going to flip it on them. So let's see how he does that. He says they believed in order, the founding fathers, but not in the order of tyranny. With them, nothing was settled that was not right. With them, justice, liberty, and humanity were final, not slavery and oppression. Listen to that again. With them, justice, liberty, and humanity were final, not slavery and oppression. Not sure, Douglas, how you get there, considering many of them enslaved people. But again, if these figures are so admirable, if what they said about liberty is so agreeable, then slavery and oppression cannot be final in the United States. He goes on to say, you may well cherish the memory of such men. They were great in their day and generation. Their solid manhood stands out the more as we contrast it with these degenerate times. Woohoo! You see what he did there? He said, you may well cherish the memory of such men. And they're going to stand out as even greater when we contrast their times with our times, as we contrast it with these, what he calls degenerate times. Flipped it on him. So I talked a minute ago, I'm going to say one more point, and then we're going to go into Douglass's critique. I talked a minute ago about the Constitution being a pro-slavery document. I think Douglass does something similar that he does with the founding fathers when he talks about the Constitution, that is lifted up as this positive document. So he says, these gentlemen have, as I think, fully and clearly vindicated the Constitution from any design to support slavery for an hour. Have fully and clearly vindicated the Constitution from any design to support slavery for an hour. Now that is going to contrast with what we just learned about, with these articles saying that the fugitive enslaved people could be returned, with these articles talking about the 3/5 compromise, saying you can't talk about slavery until 1808. How does that jive with Douglass's assertion that the Constitution does not support slavery? Here's what I think was happening. Pro-slavery leaders at the time were pointing to the Constitution as justification for the perpetuation of race-based chattel slavery. And so they were perhaps even looking at those specific areas of the Constitution as saying, hey, the framers did not repudiate slavery, therefore it must be okay. So they're trying to use the Constitution to continue their slaveholding practices. And Douglass says, no, no, no. You don't understand the intent of the Constitution. You cannot use this document, which speaks of, it enshrines the sort of operating system of a democracy, of a republic democracy. You can't use that document to support slavery. So I think that's what he was responding to. Then Douglass switches registers. He lets it all hang out. He talks in the beginning of the speech about how nervous he was. And I'm like, what are you talking about, Douglass? You've given these speeches hundreds of times by now. And I think while he was nervous was because he wasn't going to hold back. And he doesn't hold back. He says this, I read to you from before, that the paragraph that says what to the slave is the 4th of July. So he continues after that and he says, I say it with a sad sense of the disparity between us. I am not included within the pale of this glorious anniversary. Your high independence only reveals the immeasurable distance between us. Your high independence only reveals the immeasurable distance between us. My. Douglass, I just want to remind you, Drop your questions in. I want to make sure I get to them towards the end. We've just got a couple more minutes here, and then I'll transition to questions and responses. So if anything pops in your mind right now, go ahead and drop it in the comments. It's really interesting. Douglass, in his day, dealt with the questions that we even hear nowadays. Can't you be nicer? Could you be more civil? How can you reason with racists? How can you speak in a way that they'll receive? He responded to that in his speech, and he said, would you argue more and denounce less? He's like, what should I do? Would you argue more and denounce less? Would you persuade more and rebuke less? Your cause would be much more likely to succeed, is what his interlocutors say. But he says, but I submit, where all is plain, there is nothing to be argued. Listen to that. Where all is plain, there is nothing to be argued. When it's clear, I shouldn't have to argue it. I shouldn't have to explain it. He goes on to say, what point in the anti-slavery creed would you have me argue? On what branch of the subject do the people of this country need light? Do you hear what Douglass is saying? He's like, okay, you want me to argue, meaning debate more. You want me to denounce less. You want me to persuade more. You want me to rebuke less. And then my cause would be much more likely to succeed. And then Douglass goes on to say, okay, well, then what part of anti-slavery do I need to explain? And then the next few paragraphs go on to say, do I need to explain that Black people are human beings? Duh, of course they are. Do I need to explain that we're equal? Duh, of course we are. So I just love his response, like, oh, be more civil. Where all is plain, there is nothing to be argued. Somebody say amen. Y'all, I have fun with this because history has the receipts. My. I haven't even gotten to the good stuff yet. Are y'all ready? Because Douglass is about to pull out the flamethrower. He about to pull out the flamethrower on these mothers. Watch this. Watch this. Slavery is not divinely sanctioned. Here's where he talks about Christians. What then remains to be argued? Is it that slavery is not divine? That God did not establish it? That our doctors of divinity are mistaken? Brothers and sisters, do we have the boldness to go out on social media or our churches or in our blogs or in our families and say, the doctors of divinity are mistaken? They can't get right. They telling us bad about race. My. Douglass says, that which is inhuman cannot be divine. Say it again. That which is inhuman cannot be divine. I don't know if I'm about to jump out of my seat. He said, who can reason on such a proposition? They that can, may. I cannot. The time for such argument is past. Douglass goes on. He goes in toward pro-slavery Christians. Watch what he said. Listen at this. But the church of this country is not only indifferent to the wrongs of the slave, it actually takes sides with the oppressors. Let me pause here. There's a lot of people who are impeding racial progress, who hate the language of oppressed and oppressor. Did you hear me? They hate the language of oppressed and oppressor. But here we are. They want to say it's part of the modern critical race theory. Here we are in 1852 talking about oppressed and oppressor. By the way, that's Bible language, oppressed and oppressor. So don't let anybody steal that language from you, because that language has been around a lot longer than critical race theory, right? And what they're calling critical race theory anymore. Anyway, he says, Christianity has made itself the bulwark of American slavery and the shield of American slave hunters. My. Many of its most eloquent divines who stand as the very lights of the church. Hello, Dabney. Hello, Thornwell. have shamelessly, Edwards, have shamelessly given the sanction of religion and the Bible to the whole slave system. I'm sorry, I gotta speak with my hands because I can't stand up because the camera wouldn't follow me. But my. If I was at your church or event, I'd be running around right now. That's not even the blue flame. That was the yellow and orange flame. Here's the blue flame and the white hot flame of Douglass's speech toward Christians. He says, for my part, I would say, welcome infidelity, welcome atheism, welcome anything in preference to the gospel as preached by those divines. These ministers make religion a cold and flinty-hearted thing, having neither principles of right action, orthopraxy, somebody, I remember that from seminary, nor bowels of compassion. You didn't hear me? Nor bowels of compassion. They ain't got the action. They ain't got the empathy. They strip the love of God of its beauty and leave the throng of religion a huge, horrible, repulsive form. It's a religion for oppressors, tyrants, man-stealers, and thugs. Whew. Douglass said, slaveholder religion, as he calls it in his autobiography, is a religion for oppressors, tyrants, man-stealers, and thugs. I get in trouble for a lot of what I say, but I ain't never called nobody a thug in one of my speeches. Maybe I ain't bold enough. I'm taking notes. I don't know about you. All right. That speech was 1852, Ryan. You're right, Kathy. His description is still apt. And woo child. Yes, Dawn. My. So that brings us forward to the present. Douglass deals with the objection. Well, why don't you leave the past in the past? You know, the Declaration of Independence, when he's given this speech, is, 70 some years ago. Where are we now? So here's what Douglass says. My business, if I have any here today, is with the present. The accepted time with God and his cause is the ever living now. Then he quotes a poem or a song that says, trust no future, however pleasant. Let the dead past bury its dead. Act in the living present. Heart within and God overhead. Act in the living present. Heart within and God overhead. All right, so here's my 2 cents, okay? This is just Jemar talking. I personally don't think it's wrong to celebrate the 4th of July, to commemorate it somehow. Before Juneteenth, 4th of July was my favorite holiday. little fact you didn't know. Not necessarily because I was thinking about the Declaration of Independence, but because it was summer. Listen, some of y'all love winter, some of y'all love fall and spring. I love summer. Give me the heat, give me the sun, give me the outside, and give me grilling. That's why I love the 4th of July, because I can sit out all day and grill. So I still intend to do that. Now I get to do it twice in the summer. I get to do it on Juneteenth, and I get to do it on the 4th of July, okay? So have fun, enjoy it. It's a day off. The Lord knows we need rest. We need recreation. We need joy. So my philosophy, anytime we have a federal holiday, I'm going to take advantage of that sucker. I'm going to take my time off and I'm going to have fun. I'm going to be around food and family and friends because we have precious little opportunity to do so now. And we are in troubled times. So 4th of July, if you get the day off, take the day off. Enjoy the day off for a myriad reasons that have nothing to do with actually the Declaration of Independence. Here's another thing, though. We've got to engage consciously with these holidays. So at the bare minimum, we, I think, have the responsibility of telling the truth of the complexities of freedom and unfreedom. So what does that look like? I recorded an oration. I recorded this speech, myself reciting this speech on Pass the Mic. You could listen to that. And it's a long speech, y'all, so you can do it at 1.5 speed. I wouldn't be mad. But you can listen to that speech with your family, with your friends, on your own, and hear it for yourself. You can read it. There's many copies online. Just do a search. You can talk about this, just like as you pray before a meal with your family. Why not give a little 5-minute, treatment of freedom and unfreedom? Or just send them along this teach-in, right? So I do think we still have a responsibility to talk about this, right? I think it should also inspire in us boldness. Watch this. Here's what Douglass said. He said, "Oh, had I the ability and I could reach the nation's ear, I would today pour out a fiery stream of biting ridicule, blasting reproach, withering sarcasm, and stern rebuke." All right, like that was good enough. He goes on, "For it is not light that is needed, but fire. It is not the gentle shower, but thunder. We need the storm, the whirlwind, and the earthquake." So, brothers and sisters of racial justice goodwill, how will you bring the storm, the whirlwind, and the earthquake? How will you bring not simply light, but fire, not the gentle shower, but thunder to systems that continue to oppress people based on race? I would point you to my second book, How to Fight Racism. The copy is out of reach right now. But How to Fight Racism, go to jemartisby.com/books. And I break down there a framework, not just isolated steps to take, but a framework called the Arc of Racial Justice that I think can help us think through these things, okay? So if you want to know more about that. Then he says this. So I'm speaking to the church again. He says, "The American church is guilty when viewed in connection with what it is doing to uphold slavery. But it is," listen to this, "but it is superlatively guilty." What a great word, superlatively. Somebody work that into their next email. "But it is superlatively guilty when viewed in connection with its ability to abolish slavery. The sin of which it is guilty is one of omission as well as of commission. The sin of which it is guilty is one of omission as well as of commission." Then Douglass goes on to quote a man named Albert Barnes, and it says, "There is no power out of the church that could sustain slavery an hour if it were not sustained in it." Did you hear it? There is no power out of the church that could sustain slavery an hour if it were not sustained in it. What Albert Barnes is saying, if Christians did not support slavery, there was no other sector of society, no other institution, no other person or organization that could perpetuate slavery if the church didn't. In closing, Douglass said, he quoted another song, "Until that year, day, hour arrive, with head, heart, and hand I'll strive to break the rod and rend the grave, the spoiler of his prey deprive. So witness heaven, and never from my chosen post, whatever the peril or the cost, be driven. And never from my chosen post, whatever the peril or the cost, be driven. Brothers and sisters, I don't have all the answers for how you are to celebrate or commemorate the 4th of July. I simply know that history has the receipts. And I think those receipts ought to give us a sense of soberness and heaviness. Here's the last thing I'll say. We're going to have to find a way as citizens and residents of this nation, as well as people of faith, to live in the in-between. What do I mean? We are going to have to find a way to live in between aspiration and reality. To live in between what we aspire to do and be and what we are right now. Okay? So I think in this sense, we have a lot to learn from Black people in the Black church, who since the colonial era and before understood the hypocrisy of Christians, understood the hypocrisy of a nation that was supposedly dedicated to liberty and equality while enslaving millions. And yet we found ways to laugh and sing and love and build and create. That's where we are now, living in the in-between, between aspiration and reality. And that's our constant state. I just don't want us to concede to the racially regressive forces and allow them to steal our joy. That's all I got. What do you got? Hit me with the questions, comments, whatevs. Let me know what's going on. What to the present day African American is the 4th of July? Well, I think it gets really interesting now that we've got Juneteenth as a national holiday. I think actually it could help, right? Because if we commemorate both of these, then we're always much more aware of the tension, and them being only weeks apart, I think helps us to be much more aware of that tension. Whereas when it was just the 4th of July standing alone, well, it was easier to cover it over. Yeah. Any other questions? There were some from the Substack post. So watch me pull this joint up really quick. Once again, if you did appreciate this, gosh, I would love it if you subscribed to my newsletter, jemartisby.substack.com. If you consider becoming a paid subscriber, that frees up my time to be able to do more of these. And boy, we got so much more to come. One person said, who was Thomas Jefferson referring to when he stated all men being created equal in the Declaration of Independence? Very good question. Essentially, how could Thomas Jefferson, an enslaver, write the Declaration of Independence and all this yah-yah about all people being created equal, entitled to life, liberty, pursuit of happiness, all that? What was he thinking? Here's the thing, y'all. I heard a quote today saying that racism is not the shark, it's the water. Racism is not the shark, it's the water. Another way to put it similarly, white supremacy is not the shark, it's the water. Does that make sense to you? It's not the shark, it's the water. So it's not this sort of isolated threat that we can kind of pinpoint, white supremacy. It's the water we swim in. It's the air we breathe. How does that relate to Jefferson and the Declaration of Independence? By 1776, understand, from the beginning of European contact with North America, there was xenophobia, white supremacy, Euro supremacy. By the 1660s, they had switched what had been English common law, which said that a child's status derives from the status of their father. That had been English common law forever. They switched that to say, oh, no, it's the mother. It's matrilineal, not patrilineal. So already now, which meant an enslaved person was born into slavery, it also meant that a white enslaver could rape a black woman and not have that child would be born into slavery, and the enslaver wouldn't have any sort of familial responsibilities, right? So that had already been in place for over a century when the Declaration of Independence was written. This white supremacy, this exploitation of black labor was already part of the American way before there was such a thing as America. What I'm trying to say is, by the time Thomas Jefferson writes the Declaration of Independence, there's no real tension there. It had become such a part of the accepted culture at that point that the framers of the Declaration didn't even feel a need to qualify the statement regarding all people created. Of course, they were talking about white people. You know, the question of African descended people in North America had long since been settled, and the way they settled it was to call us inferior. What I'm trying to say is that was so much part of the accepted culture, especially among the elite at that time, that it really, in my view, probably didn't even occur to them, oh, this might be troublesome if black people hear it, or people in other nations hear it, and they call us out on our slavery. It was wild, man. It was wild. And then even now. Okay, so can I give you a contemporary application? Let me see if I can find the specifics here. It was on Twitter today. This thing have you ever heard of Hillsdale College? Hillsdale College in Hillsdale, Michigan, has branded itself, made a name for itself, positioned itself, and made a lot of money as an uber conservative Christian college, right? It's a fundamentalist school. They are influencing events nationally because they are the ones behind something called the Hillsdale curriculum. I'm not sure if it's also the 1776 curriculum, if it's one and the same, but essentially what it's doing is attempting to have this revisionist view of history that downplays racism, downplays slavery, and has this very triumphal view of the history of the United States, one of constant progression, right? The reason why this is making national news is because first Tennessee and now Florida are trying to adopt the curriculum, and they're sending teachers to trainings for this Hillsdale 1776 curriculum. It's a very pernicious thing. It's part of this whole anti-CRT thing. It's part of the pushback against the 1619 Project. Fun fact, my How to Fight Racism Young Readers edition was put on a proposed banned books list of libraries in Hillsdale, Michigan. The individual who proposed this banned books list, on which my book was listed, is a undergraduate alum and a current graduate student at Hillsdale College. So this guy who wants to ban my book, teaching kids their agency to fight against racism, is part of this Hillsdale College orbit. And I bring that up because these folks are looking at 1776 as almost this unadulterated good and positive thing without talking about the tensions that you and I have been discussing this whole session. And it's again in pushback against the 1619 Project that says actually slavery was as foundational to the history of this country as the Declaration of Independence. So that's just a little contemporary application which I hope justifies your time tonight, because this stuff is all very relevant. Okay. Any other questions? Florida, you a mess. John, you said it well. At least Ron DeSantis and his followers are a mess. So yeah, y'all, thank you for your time tonight. I hope it was helpful. Here's the one other helpful thing you can do. In addition to signing up for the newsletter, jemartisby.sec.com. I said it 3 times now, y'all. I said it 3 times. So somebody take some action. Be the thunder. Support. In addition to that, what other topics would you like to hear about? So I love these teach-ins. I love getting to interact with you. I love seeing the folks who are interested in this. There are so many different sort of holidays and historical events coming up. It sort of helps to tie it in with that, but it can be on any variety of topic. Again, I focus on race, religion, social movements. So if it's out of that field, it's probably not in my wheelhouse, although I can do interviews too. So look, tell me what you want to hear about. Or if you even want to hear more from me. By the way, I got this new shirt. I like it. Let me know other topics. So you can go to my latest post. I'll post this video again on my newsletter, and then I'll put a question there, like what other topics would you want to hear about? Reparations, church, great one, John. Involuntary relocation. Wow. So awesome. Y'all are great. I'm gonna let you get to it. Bear this in mind. Share it, share it, share it, share it, share it, so other people can have this leading into the July 4th weekend. Thank you so much for your time. I've really appreciated, and I'll see you next time. Peace out.